Hi guys, Ryu here, and in this one we're gonna be talking about shapes, basically squared, triangular, and spherical or circular. When they work together well and when they don't, how to create an interesting balance of shapes. Because when you think about it, even in Blender you have the basic shapes of primitives, which is a cylinder, cube, sphere, and cone, right? Which is a triangle, basically a rectangle, square, and the circle. They will work and they will not. It really depends on the composition, what you're going for, and actually how you're going to place them together. So we're going to talk about that. Then, for example, triangles and circles are extremely powerful. The triangles are male, very dominant and dynamic shapes. Any really diagonal lines are going to be very dynamic. They're going to add movement and kinetic energy to your image, whereas circles going to supple things down, right? They're going to make everything soft and supple and kind of gentle. And also, you know, circles can be extremely powerful when you put them in a rectangular environment. So let's say you got a lot of vertical and horizontal lines, and you're going to drop a circle in the middle. That's going to have an incredible impact on the composition, because it's going to draw your attention to it, right? Then, you know, overdoing shapes is not a good idea. For example, going with everything circular or everything triangular, everything rectangular, it can work, but overdoing them is not the best idea, right? Then triangles, for example, can link things together. I'll show you examples in a minute. I just want to briefly discuss what we're going to be talking about. Triangles can link areas, can create links in between areas, and can make it in a very dynamic fashion, all right? And it can kind of fuse your design together, okay? Weld it together. Then squares are very, very dull. Now, why they're dull? They're dull because they're very balanced, okay? If you think about a square, so if I go to Blender, maybe not this Blender, I'm going to go to this Blender, okay? See, the thing about rectangles is, right, that they're much more dynamic, because you have dominant edges and you got less dominant edges, right? Because they're shorter. You got this interesting game of proportions here, whereas square is really, really dull, all right? There's nowhere really to go, nowhere to pay attention to, and you would need to actually direct the viewer to different places by using details. Whereas in rectangle, you kind of have this dynamic sort of feeling by looking at different length of lines. So when you introduce different length of lines, you will introduce interesting dynamism to your work. Okay, so squares can be used. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying they're very static, okay? Then, like I said, diagonals are very dynamic. So diagonals are very dynamic, and they're really incredibly sort of aggressive. So if you, for example, look at this design, it's very supple, but at the same time, because of these diagonal lines, this kind of like a zigzag, like a, you know, lightning shape thing, it looks dynamic. So I'm balancing the supple shape of the structure of this robotic arm with diagonal lines. Also, we have a lot of circles. I mean, a lot of circles here, right? Now the base is kind of like a square, but it's so rounded it looks almost like a circle, especially from this perspective, right? But it's not a circle. But then you got all these circles here and supple lines everywhere, but they're balanced by kind of like, you know, cutouts in the mesh, very strong cuts in here and here, and also very straight cut in here. Then when you get closer, you can see that there's a lot of angular edges in here, right, all over the place, if you really zoom closely. And you know, they're balancing this kind of very, very soft structure. So this is why I positioned this arm like this for renders, because when I was creating renders, right, I wanted this dynamic feel, but I wanted to soften it up. Also, remember in the video when I was talking about design and blockouts, I told you to take examples from nature. So now the idea for the head, remember when I was talking about design and how it's important to draw from nature? This is a crossover between chameleon and a mantis. So when you look at pictures of mantis, right, and then you look at the chameleon, see what I mean? When you look at certain angles, you can see that it's kind of like a blend between these two, okay? So I wanted to make it feel organic, but at the same, because I have very supple shapes, so supple as you know, kind of nature based, but then at the same time mechanical. So I wanted to emphasize that nature by maintaining these sharp angles and also giving it some massive, slightly more angular cutouts. Like I said, diagonals are dynamic, verticals are stable, and horizontals are soothing. All right. When you see horizontal lines, and I'm gonna give you an example from my photography. Okay, so actually, you know what? We can go to this page here and go to architecture. It's gonna be a perfect example in architecture, I'm pretty sure, right? And this is a very good example. This has all the lines and all the shapes. Okay. Now you have squares because it's framing a square, which is an exceptionally rare way of framing for me. I think I have like maybe 2 or 3 photos squared, that's it. But I use a square because I wanted to emphasize the different shapes inside of the photo, because you got sphere, you got rectangles, you got diagonals, you got you got horizontal lines, and you can see that horizontal lines are oozing peace and quiet and stillness. Okay, horizontal lines are calming everything down. Vertical lines, especially when they angled, diagonal, they're very dynamic, they're aggressive. And also they lead to this main feature. And then you got this payoff, which is a very, very soft sphere with some kind of rectangular, you know, cutout and a lot of squares in it. So the square, you know, of this photo is emphasizing the little tiny squares of the main object in here, which is undoubtedly this sphere. Okay, so even framing of your photo is important. Like, look, for example, how much more dynamic this photo is, right? This one with all these diagonals and you know, all these diagonals here, because if you look at this, there's a diagonal here, diagonal here, diagonal here, and it's bent. Now when you look, for example, at this photo, right, you'll see a very different dynamic. You'll see that, you know, it's very centered, because that was the point, and you can see that these horizontal lines bring peace, but the verticals are very powerful. They're very you know, they're very establishing lines. Okay, and it just makes this structure look much more massive and intimidating. So here, for example, opposing to that image I showed you before, you have very straight lines. I made sure that the camera distortion, the lens distortion, was corrected. So you got very horizontal lines and very vertical lines, and just a few dynamic diagonal lines, which are very powerful in here because they form a triangle. Yeah, they form a triangle. So this is a very, you know, angular photo on purpose. And then you got these human shapes, which are very organic, contrasting with this, you know, steel and glass structure, right, of Tokyo. So that's how you can use form to design your models. Okay. Then this is also a good example of how to use shapes to create sensation and mood, right? So this is a very good photo to emphasize that. When you have this very empowering, kind of intimidating, very tall, going to, you know, like ever-growing structures, because you can't see the top of them, right? So they're very intimidating. And I shot from a very low angle, which makes these human look just tiny. So by adding the human scale, you make them, you know, much larger and much more intimidating. And these massive vertical lines just increase that feeling of, you know, being just dwarfed by this massive glass and steel structure. So you can use lines to empower your image, and, you know, just like kind of drawing with a bold line and just you know, sending a message with a bold text. It's just gonna jump at you, right? So you can use shapes. You can use shapes to emphasize something in the image. Now, soft versus hard angles and plane shifts. This is actually really important. Okay, if you look closely at this model, right, I'm just gonna turn off this render mode so you can see a bit better. So if you see here, for example, there are a lot of plane changes. Okay, there's a, you know, there's a plane, it's not straight. Okay, there's a plane change in here, like goes like this. Okay, and then there's a plane change in here, there's a plane change in this area because you got to shift like this, right? And then you got the gap, and you got another plane change, and then you got chamfers. Now, because I knew I'm going to be running trim sheets, I didn't use much of a difference in terms of the bevel width, although this chamfer is slightly smaller than this one. When you go to rendered mode, right, you can see that I was using trim sheets, so I knew I'm going to be breaking that surface into smaller elements. So, you know, I was thinking kind of ahead. But you have a lot of, you know, plane shifts in this area, okay? The same here. You got plane shifts all over the place. You got plane shift in here. Now, why do you need plane shifts? You need plane shifts because this is how light is going to define your form. When you have a plane shift, okay, the light's going to cast an interesting shadow. For example, if I go here, right, to this photo, you see this shadow here, this game of shadows and highlights here, and this beautiful kind of like a highlight here, and this kind of a shadow being turned into slight highlight here, is happening because this arm is not straight. It's actually, you know, widening towards the end, right? So they're not straight arms. Same in here. It's narrowing down here to meet this joint. So structurally, this is how it was designed, okay? Which is why this is going to create this beautiful shadow here. If this was flat, you would have just a constant, you know, like here on this surface, you would have constant level of lighting, okay? Constant level of brightness and darkness. So I wanted to create some interest with shadows by changing the form. You can play with plane shifts and you can play with soft shapes versus hard shapes. So now you can play with angle shifts and plane shifts, and you can play with hard versus soft shapes to create very interesting balance in foam, right? This very much relates to the next one, which is shape transitions. So in here, in this example, what you can see is that this circle, right, transitions to this kind of like a semi-oval, narrowing, tapering shape, okay? So it's angular on the bottom, but it's very supple on the top to correspond with more of an angular feature of this base, but also more of a curved feature of this first arm. Also, when you use elements like circles, it is exceptionally important. Yeah, this is really crucial. It's important to frame them. So when you use circles, you always try to frame them. For example, you know, I got a circle in here. It's framed by this one and another one. This circle here is framed by this kind of like a, you know, semicircle and then tapering sort of like a rectangle, right? You always want to try to frame your circles. Like here, this one here is emphasized by this shape here, but it's also very angular on the bottom. So you know, this is how you can create interesting transitions between shape and also shape harmony in your design. So here, for example, the same. You got this very oval shape, circular, and then you got more of a rectangular one, which kind of fits in. So I didn't want it to create the same. I could actually, you know, what I could have done is I could have used lattice to deform this bit here into a circle, but I think it would weaken the entire shape of this form, right? So by adding these bolts, right, on the top here, I suggested that this one is mounted inside in here under this shell. All right, makes sense? So one more time, shape balance, exceptionally important, okay? Shape balance is very easy to show in photography. This is one of my favorite photos I took. And you can see there is an almost very straight rectangular form of hair combined with very soft and supple face and all these, you know, very soft flowing lines, shadows, etc., right? And then you got this massive, beautiful negative space, okay? So this is a very good example of using very hard edges with very soft forms, and you can do the same thing with your design. And I got a lot of you know, that kind of an example in my photography. Like for example, here you got a very powerful straight, you know, kind of like an angular jaw. You got a massive triangle here out of hair, and then you got this soft, you know, soft lines all over the place, going around the shoulders, you know, softness everywhere. And then you got this, even triangles here are made of soft fuzzy hair. So you got balance of forms and lines. This is really important in your design, okay? This is another example, a cool example of how to combine rectangular shapes with something that's really supple and soft. You got very rounded nature of this scope, right? You got all these circles here being emphasized and framed by more supple lines, but then at the same time you got very angular cuts, very sharp bevels here in the bottom, and this entire base is very sharp. Okay, so it gradually transitions from very soft shape into very hard shape. And the same, I balance this very soft and delicate, you know, shape of the scope with very angular text, which kind of corresponds with the bottom. So the choice of font, the choice of booleans here wasn't accidental. It was just me thinking about how to merge these, you know, forms together. Now, when you look at a bad image, you cannot really point out what's wrong with it, but you know that something is not right because the balance is off. So the whole trick is to maintain balance between shadows and lights, form transitions, and how the whole image is composed. So when I, for example, render, okay, I'm going to place lighting accordingly to what kind of objects I'm shooting. I'm going to position my camera, my focal length, my background, everything is important. If you're going to approach your renders from a random point of view, any lighting setup will do, any background will do, you will never end up with, you know, beautiful renders on your portfolio because they all also require a lot of care. And just like you balance shape throughout the design, you need to balance light and shadow throughout your renders. Okay, this is all connected.